I'm Michael Wood. I'm a filmmaker and program maker. I'm part of an independent film company and have been for 30 years. Make films for BBC and PBS and worldwide. I'm a professor of history at Manchester University as well, sort of as a part-time. And I'm a writer of history books.
And inside the shrine, you're reminded again of the old customs of Mesopotamian worship in the glittering Holy of Holies, whose magnificence distantly reflects something of that old pre-Islamic world. Feel what a dynamic force Iraqi Islam, Shia and Sunni, has been through history.
I studied history at Oxford and did postgraduate research in Oxford. And actually, when I was a student, I studied that period of the origins of Islam, right back at the beginnings, 7th century, and always found it fascinating. And I travelled and filmed in Sunni Muslim, predominantly Sunni Muslim countries. But I suppose my first real encounter with Shiism, like a lot of people, came after the 79 revolution in Iran, and when suddenly the question of what the Shia faith was and the beliefs which distinguished it from the Sunni world and became really important and fascinating. So I think everybody was fascinated then in my line of business, whether you were a historian or a journalist. But then almost immediately, of course, the revolution was transformed by all sorts of things, and then by the war between Iran and Iraq, which is such an immense tragedy. So through the 80s, that was just, it was horrendous. But as soon as the war was over, I had a chance to go to Iraq at the end of the 80s. And that was the first and only time I've been to Karbala, funnily enough. I went a couple of times right at the end of the 80s, the last time in the winter of 89, and travelled through southern Iraq, went to the marshes, actually stayed in the marshes at that time, and visited Karbala. All of it then under Saddam's power, really. You were very aware of the military presence everywhere you went. And by then I'd already got interested in the Shia faith. I'd come to London from Manchester in the late 80s, and there used to be a Muslim bookshop in Charing Cross Road called Al-Huda. And you know that feeling when you somebody opens a door to a world that you knew very little about. And anyway, the Al-Huda bookshop and a library ticket at SOAS Library were the things that did it for me. And I used to sit there in the SOAS Library with the open shelves of the stacks and going, wow, I didn't know anything about this, And you pick up books by people like the great French Islamic scholar Henri Corbin, who wrote a lot about the Shia world. And you discover that what you thought you knew about Islamic culture and philosophy and all these things, just there's huge gaps. We're all taught things about the great figures in Islamic intellectual history, and what you don't realize is that this tradition carried on through the 15, 16, 17, 18, 1900s with in the Shia world. There's an incredible period of cultural regeneration through that whole period as well. And so I got really hooked on all that stuff, and used to often have to pick them up in French in those days because they weren't available in English translation. But I got really interested in all that. So that was all built up, and then I had a chance to go to the heartland of the Shia, into southern Iraq. And that was really great, even though the circumstances for the Shia at that time, under Saddam, of course, was a Sunni ruler with a Sunni minority power over Iraq, as they had been for centuries. It was really, really interesting. And when the 91 war happened and the risings in Iraq, 14 of the 19 provinces rose against Saddam. Imam Khoei gave his fatwa asking the Iraqi people to commit no acts of violence or revenge, or no looting, no this, behave to your neighbours of whatever faith with justice. It was an incredible moment. And then the Allies allowed the revolt to be crushed. And it was at that point that I got involved with the Shia community in London through the Waqia Foundation. Well, after the 91 uprising, and what happened in the South was so terrible, and the Karbala was almost destroyed by Saddam's army. Vast numbers of people were killed, 300,000 people was the estimate. And then he instituted this thing of draining the marshes to destroy the society in the southern marshes. And as things unfolded that autumn, I got in touch with Yusuf al-Khawi, whose grandfather was the Imam of the whole Shiite world, Grand Ayatollah al-Khawi. And I wrote to Yusuf and said, we're a film company, if there's anything we can do to help. There've been these moves to get a no-fly zone as they had against the Kurds, and it didn't happen. So I got involved with Yusuf and the foundation and wrote journalism. We did short films for The World This Week, Week in Politics. If important figures from the Shiite world came to London, we whizzed them around to the BBC World Service or the Voice of America, all that. People like Hussein Shahristani, who was living in Tehran at that time. And of course, we had a lot of public demonstrations and, big demonstration in Trafalgar Square. Where you met a lot of really great figures, the exiles, famous scholars, Bar al-Ulum and other great people. And women were a very dynamic part of it as well, of course. It was very progressive, it seemed, at that time. And then we made a big film called Saddam's Killing Fields, which was in America was called Saddam's Latest War. And I went to Kurdistan to interview survivors of what had happened in the South who'd got up to Kurdistan. With friends from the foundation. And then Yusuf and I went to Tehran, and we went down to Susangar, Awaz and Susangard, and we went into the marshes through the Iranian side. Without permission to actually go into the military zone, but because he was Al-Khawi was his name, it was like a password, and we got through into the marshes, and we interviewed survivors there. And that was a very harrowing time, and the documentary got a lot of awards and was shown many, many times in different places. Even the script was translated into Arabic and circulated in southern Iraq as a sort of bootleg kind of thing, And it was a plea for what was happening in the South to be taken seriously by the Allies, who had betrayed essentially the people of South Iraq in 91. Saddam had a jet on the tarmac to fly to exile in Algeria, I think, and they let him stay in power because the Americans and the Saudis and their allies feared a Shiite majority in Iraq. And of course it was a fatal error. There was a possibility in 91 that a democratic Iraq might have arisen without the terrible suffering that it endured. So it was a catastrophic error. I can remember being in the marshes that incredibly hot summer of 1993, and I met a Shiite cleric there from Najaf who said one night that he feared that if this went on for another 10 years, then the goodness of the people would be destroyed, was the phrase he used. And we sat there, and that was the summer of 93, 10 years before the second invasion and the horrors that have happened. So it was a really fatal moment, So all through that period, we got, just helping a little bit, sort of publicizing, making films. The films were shown in America. We got an interview with the, White House, and so that's what we were doing. But in the process, I got obviously very close to all my friends in the London Shiite community, and especially with the mosque in Queen's Park, where the Waqia Foundation is. And my wife and I, and sometimes our kids, we'd go to Ashura, it was quite touching actually to see them cooking for Hussein in the streets of Queen's Park, with the great tureens of food that you'd see in Najaf and Karbala, and there it was being cooked in London, and it was a tragic time in a way, because, you know, I remember one Ashura in the early to mid-90s, around that time, when they'd got black and white photographs of hundreds and hundreds of people, of the families of the exiles in London, all of whom had died under Saddam. And the whole of the great prayer hall in Queen's Park was covered with these photographs, as well as the mosque being hung with black for Hussein, you know. So that was a very tough time. And I wrote the obituaries for some of the leading figures who died under Saddam. Taghi al-Khoui, Garawi, Imam Sadr, al-Khoui himself, of course. Later, Majid, who has died under the second invasion. So it was all that was tough, really, for the friends. But what you understood from it as a non-Muslim was that the lamentations that took place in Ashura had an immense emotional intensity. Immense intensity. And the lament seemed to be about the fate of the people of Iraq. You know, you were lamenting something that took place in 680 in our calendar, but you were also lamenting the tragedies of here and now. And that was something that I came to understand about what the Shia lamentations were about. Do you know what I mean? So they're about a tragic human destiny in some ways. You know, they transcend any of one faith. You know, and those forms of lamentation are very deeply ingrained, especially in the culture of the Near East, in Jewish culture as well. You know, but of course more than any in the Shia. You're dealing with a really tragic event that took place in real history. You know, a handful of people. I can't remember exactly how many is it. So about 70 people with him. And that 72. And outnumbered by a vast army and deprived of water, women and children. So it's a tragic, terrible story. And and obviously you learn the importance of that to the Shiite community. And it's a real event, not a mythic event. And of course all Shia will tell you that it's about justice in the end, you know. And I remember people at the time, old people in Queen's Park, saying to me, "Oh, you know, you would never shake the hand of a tyrant," you know, and all these sort of things. So you learn the importance of that story to the Shiite community, I think. And it's you also see how that narrative replicates itself in history, you know. And I've met a few communities in my life who are more aware of history than the Shia, because part of your identity comes from history. It's history that you hold on to so powerfully, and so it's like a parable, isn't it? You know. So, but you know, they're very human things. You know, speaking as a non-Muslim and not a religious person, you know, these are very, very human things. I remember one strange. This is just a little personal story, but I'd been to Karbala, you see, and I'd been to the tomb of Imam Hussein. I'd been inside the mosque, and in a time when Saddam's troops were on guard everywhere. And then I'd sat in London and made the first film, big film we did, and we'd got this incredible footage in Tehran, shot by two brothers from the mosque of Imam Hussein as Saddam's troops closed in. And this is a very, very famous piece of footage now. And we got an original copy of this from Tehran. And you saw the horror of it, and the improvised medical station inside the mosque, and the screaming of the people, and the tanks coming in, and very, very powerful. And you saw also the shattering aftermath of the destruction, shot by an Australian film crew who just ran the cameras. They were allowed in the following month, and they ran the camera in all the way up to the Great Mosque. And you saw the shattered mosque, and every building on that great long approach, you know, that wonderful approach when you walk all the way up to the which is now is filled again with pilgrims at Ashura. Then it was empty, every building smashed. and the mosque itself, the names of the imams, machine gun, the blood on the walls, the whole thing. It was an incredible vision. And I remember then being involved with the community and having a dream. And in the dream, I'd gone back to Karbala, and I had walked up that long pathway, and all the only people there, everything was closed up, and the only people there were the Saddam soldiers. And I was ushered in a long, circuitous route to come into the mosque, which had been restored but was kind of empty and sealed off, And I went almost to the heart of the mosque, but didn't get to the tomb. And then I could hear some commemoration was still happening, as if the life of the mosque had not been destroyed. But then I was ushered away on a circuitous route away and out along a long passageway in which I realized the whole of the Karbala was now surrounded by water, as if it was on an island in a lake, And I wasn't allowed to go to the center in my dream. And I remember feeling a kind of desire to go to lament, because of the tragedies that we'd seen. And I remember Shiite friends of mine saying, the hidden imam has come to you in a dream, and we all kind of laughed about it, sitting in a bar in Tehran, But these things have powerful effect, you see, because it was an immense tragedy. So I suppose what I'm saying to you is my response in a personal way was that we had, even at a distance, we'd not suffered we'd no idea of the suffering of our friends and their families and everything else, but because we'd participated in it and we'd received the news and we'd been to Ashura those years and we'd had some sense of it, then you are emotionally bound up with it all. I think it has that impact, and people understand that, I think. And people are much more aware about the Shia community now. When we started doing our stuff in 1991, there wasn't enough knowledge about the Shia world and its ideas. And it had been very much tarred with a particular way of seeing Shiism because of the Iranian Revolution. And there was an anti-Shiite kind of thing in a lot of Western journalism because of the Iranian Revolution. Nobody quite could see that actually, the West and the Americans had played the major role in the overthrow of the Iranian democracy in the 1950s. They'd supported the Shah's tyrannical, autocratic regime. That there were many reasons why the Iranian Revolution took place, but the Americans weren't prepared to see that. And of course, the Iranian Revolution, for a moment, had been full of hope and optimism, and for a variety of reasons, that hope was lost in many important ways. But the disaster was compounded almost immediately by the war between Iran and Iraq, in which the West supported Iraq. So a series of absolutely enormous tragedies kind of accelerated that thing. So that was the background to the very anti-Shia mood that was in a lot of places, which in journalism in the West and all that, and that underlays some of the reaction to the leaving Saddam in power in 1991, to the reasons for that. People know much more about it now, and it's much better known in the Western world. But people need to know more. And one of the things we've been talking about recently with the Khoi Foundation has been this very poor coverage of the Shia on BBC educational websites. And we've been trying to encourage them to do a really better coverage in conjunction with the Open University, and to make more films about the Shia beliefs, the rituals, the ideas about what the faith is, and so on. So, and it's slow progress. They don't seem to understand what the problem is. And so I do think the story still, for everybody, has a great power, and is a meaningful story to people of other faiths and religions. But more important than that still is actually understanding each other better, empathy and all this stuff. I'm sure that story can play part of it, but why we got involved was above all because of discrimination against the Shia, the political discrimination, social and religious discrimination. These things are still really, really important. As you hardly need to be told on this channel, the fermenting of anti-Shia feeling from Wahhabi and Salafi forces in the world is very severe at the moment. And I'm not talking abstractly about that, because I film everywhere in the world and I see it everywhere. Our Shia friends in Pakistan are frightened of doing rituals in public now because of the antagonism. Everywhere you go there is this, you just look at what's happening in the Gulf, for example, in Bahrain and Saudi, and there are major issues still. So that's the area that has most concerned me, I suppose.